This panel promises to be a very interesting. See, it was the emphasis on very, Hala. I knew you'd appreciate that. I'm not going to say too much more except to hand it over to the host for this conversation, Hala Abdelnour. I could read you her bio. But I'm not going to. Instead, I'm going to say that she is a remarkable woman that I still like, even though she called me old this morning. Because I didn't use technology in the way that was required. Nonetheless, I've forgiven her, but she truly is one of those activists that I think practices what she preaches. She has worked in over 50 countries. She speaks 6 languages. The Greek's not so good, but she thinks it is. She's current chair of Diaspora Action Australia, and of course she's the founder of the Institute of Non-Violence, a qualified and experienced consultant trainer with specialist skills in family violence, intersectionality, and diversity and inclusion. But what I think is particularly significant about her work is that she brings all of that theory into the realm of practice. Please join me in welcoming this amazing panel and the host, Hala Abdelnour.
Thank you, Maria. Anything I say to you is always done with love, you know. You're not old. I always aspire to just be like you, that's it. And my Greek is much better than Maria's. Yeah, it's the Macedonian. I just want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri, Waiwarang people in the Boon Wurrung people of the Eastern Kulin Nations, whose lands we're on. I woke up this morning and my mind did this visual thing where I tried to strip away the buildings that exist on this land, and I tried to imagine the wealthy ecosystem that was here before, and tried to imagine what that was like, what life was like before we built all this stuff on it. And grateful that we can just sort of walk freely on this land, but I hope we all do it with acknowledgement to what that means, and off whose backs we get this freedom. It's an absolute honour to be here, and thank you Irfan and Sophie Kind Enterprises for inviting us back. It's been a pleasure working with you. I don't know where you are, I'm looking around like, there you are, thank you, out the back. It's been an absolute pleasure working with you this year, in the little bits that we could do to support the work that you do. It's just always a pleasure. And Stacey and Joe from One Room Step. I have had the privilege for a number of years, a few months, a year at least, to have this conversation with the women that joined me on the stage today. I probably hound them quite a lot, you know, sort of, can we do a Zoom chat and vent about the intersections between gender and race? Something I've just been really passionate about. I don't know, it's sort of arisen in various ways for me from 2020, in, you know, it's strong, you know, sometimes you just think of something and it slaps you in the face and then you just see it everywhere. So this panel's exciting for me, and I'm glad to hear from a number of you already that you were looking forward to it. I am not going to read bios. You will get to know something about the panel members up here, who I adore and respect so deeply. So I'm going to ask you all to bring yourself into the conversation. Before I do that, I need to explain how this session's going to happen. It's a bit conversational, so we're going to have a conversation up here and unpack a little bit of the themes, the topic of this panel. And around, I'm going to look at this watch, which is in Perth timing, so it's great. Like, I spend a lot of my time trying to convert times from what time zone am I in now, so that kind of works for me. I feel like I'm traveling. But around half an hour or so in, we're going to gauge what's happening and at some point invite you. It's an interactive panel. So this is another format of conferencing. It usually is done in a room that looks completely different to this, so we're improvising today. But there are 2 empty seats here, and at some point, particularly if we see people coming down and interested in lining up, you'll be invited to come up and join the panel. And we ask you to do that respectfully and mindful of others that want to join the panel as well. So be like 5 minutes, say, Max, come up, share something from your work, join the conversation. You can ask a question from up here. So you get to participate with us in the conversation. And you're also welcome to ask questions from the audience as well. So when we open it up to audience interaction, you have those 2 options. And we have Layla from the Institute. Thank you, Layla's just down there. She's got a microphone for audience questions. And Hannah down the front here from the Institute will sort of support you to get up on the stage. And Amali's going to take photos, so smile as you do it. So I just want to thank the team too for coming along and supporting us today. All right, let's bring you all in. Who are you? And why is this topic important to you? If you could introduce yourselves however you'd like and say something with us, share something with us today about the work you're doing that resonates with the theme of the intersections of gender and race or the racialization of gender-based violence. Perhaps we'll start with you, Ruby.
Hi, I'm Ruby, and well, obviously my book, White Tears, Brown Scars, but am I on? Okay. That obviously is sort of the first protocol for me in terms of my work and how it illustrates the way that various intersections, in particular race and gender, collide. It's getting a little bit old now. It's a few years old, so I'm in the sort of the finishing. I've been saying this for a while now, but I keep taking time off. But I am towards the end of my PhD, and very interestingly, it is also looking at how race and gender collide, but not with white people this time. So I'm actually looking at media coverage of the women who joined ISIS, and I'm looking at how the coverage of those women's gender and race/culture/religion, where in terms of how they're subjected or presumed to be subjected to violence, and whether or not this then erases the experience of violence at the hands of ISIS of non-ISIS women, so Yazidi women, Assyrian women, and other Syrian women. So it's been very, very interesting. It obviously lends quite a lot to, our experiences of race and gender in the West as well, but obviously very different because it's, the women of ISIS would be both privileged and subordinated in the similar ways to white women in the West, but also different because white women just, whiteness, there's nothing above it in the sense of world power and world history and colonialism. Whereas with the ISIS women, whatever privileges they have as women, as part of the dominating structure, they are still subject to the white gaze and to white scrutiny. So that's that. Yeah.
Scratching the surface. Elizabeth. It's okay, we can share. Elizabeth Ayom Lang is my name. I come from Burulu, Perth. I live and work on Wajak Noongar country. I also want to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land on which we're in today, the Wurundjeri and Wai Waring and Boon Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. In terms of, I guess by way of a brief introduction, who I am, that's a very interesting question because I get that question all the time, and depending on what context, different people mean different things. So I'll attack it, I guess, at different points. In terms of culturally, or my background, I'm South Sudanese originally, and I migrated to Australia when I was quite young. I think an aspect of my identity that's quite key to the work that I do is the influence that my father has had on my life. He's now passed, but our arrival into Australia was through a refugee humanitarian pathway. And I guess the background story to that, without going into too much detail, there's a very colonial history that has led to a civil war that started long before I was born. And my father's political activism was what led our family to eventually leave the north at the time, which is not where I come from originally, but where I was raised, moving into Egypt and then moving to Australia at the age of 10. So I guess in terms of my kind of background, it's very kind of solidly in a human rights activism framework in terms of my father's political activities that continued long into kind of his late years before he passed. And it's not until later on that I kind of realized how much of an impact that had in terms of, he was in Australia ill, but still writing letters and trying to advocate for human rights violations within my country. So that's kind of, I think that's key in terms of my identity. The other aspect is in terms of the work that I do around equity and inclusion, very much focused on gender and race. So looking at, I guess, and this conversation is really key for me because a lot of what I do in terms of, I do a lot of research in the area of family violence as well as training. So as far as research, I'm also doing my PhD. My thesis, it's a very long title, so bear with me, Conceptualizing Domestic and Family Violence in the Frame of Collectivist Cultures. And what led me to that research was the training that I was doing and the so-called universal frameworks that we were using to, I guess, raise awareness around family violence. And there was always a voice in the back of my head going, something doesn't quite fit. And when I did further kind of digging and came across a report that was done around Australia with women from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, and I say that in quotes, one of the biggest themes that came out of that was the women were sharing that they felt like their experiences were kind of understood in a very different context and by the practitioners that were trying to support them. And when I read that, coupled with the voice that I had in the back of my mind for many years going, something doesn't fit, the penny dropped for me and I thought, there's further investigation to be done in this area. So it is practice-led research, so that's what led me into it. And a lot of that I think we'll be unpacking today, but a lot of these so-called universal frameworks were developed predominantly in the 1980s. And to be honest, they don't even work for white people, let alone everybody else, because conceptions around family have changed since the 1980s, but the frameworks have not necessarily moved on. So we'll unpack that a little bit, but I think that it's probably enough for now.
So that's a very tough question, Hala. Who am I? We don't have all day, we don't have tomorrow. So I'm just going to tell you my name. My name is Juliana Nkrumah. I work, in Australia, when you go to work, they give you a title. But I say to people, I don't do what my title says I do. I work in women, equity, and domestic and family violence. What drives me, what my passion is women's human rights. And why I say that is over more than 30 years, I have had a passion in Australia to raise voices of women, of marginalized communities, and mainly, specifically, women from the continent of Africa. This is my story. I woke up and I was an Akan girl in the middle of Ghana. I left Ghana to Zimbabwe and I was a Ghanaian. I reached Australia and I was African. And I was like, hello, hang on a minute. I cannot carry the continent. And I spent 5 years getting public servants to understand the diversity, commonalities, and differences among groups of people coming from the continent, and nobody would listen. and up to today, nobody wants to listen. It's called absolute laziness and ineffective delivery of services. I'm an old lady. That's why I carry my walking stick. Don't diss my ability because I've got a big mouth. And my big mouth is about this, helping to bring in social change. Right now, what I do is not for me or my cohort group. What I do is for the future. And as a person who has grown up in colonization and really understand colonization, I agree with the lady this morning who said it was not an event, it's an ongoing process. So we've come into another process of colonization. That's racializing gender-based violence. I work with that woman called Maria Dimopoulos, and we go around Australia talking about racialized violence. We put it under complex forms of violence because that's what Australia understands. But when we get you in a room, we talk the R word, whether you like it or not. So that's what we're doing today. Thank you. Is that enough?
It's never enough from you. But yeah, we have more time to hear so much more. So before we get into the crux of it, you know, we are aware that there's a lot of intellect in the room. And I guess in the spirit of intersectionality being just butchered as a theory in the way it's presented, and the taken understanding of what it is, particularly at a policy level, you know, at systemic levels where it really matters to get intersectionality right, we don't. So I guess we're going to just unpack some of the concepts very quickly, but, you know, starting with what we mean by intersections and intersectionality for this panel. Oh, sorry, and Rubia, do you mind? We've rehearsed this before, so she knew.
In my queue. Yeah, so, yeah, it's really sad, but it's hard for me not to hear or say the word intersectionality now without cringing. And it's sad because it is such an important and illuminating, you know, theory and metaphor and way to illustrate what we talk about. And the reason, well, let me, you know, start off by saying the way in its definition, in the way that, you know, Professor Kimberly Crenshaw defined it, is looking at the way in which power, not identity, power collides and intersects. So we're not just saying there's racism over there, there's homophobia over here, there's transphobia here, there's Islamophobia there. Because that, in the way that she defines it and describes it and analyses it, that actually can whitewash, or it can actually gloss over the way in which, when these various forms of oppression and power do collide, the way in which it affects particular people at particular times. So when we look at, you know, for instance, transphobia as separate to race, we're going to miss the fact that the vast majority of the violence against trans people, in particular trans women, is against black trans women, right? You can't deny the role that race plays in that. And the same with gender and misogyny, gender-based violence. So when we're looking at sexism and misogyny, race is a huge factor because it does affect non-white women in a compounded way. So the emphasis when we talk about intersections, the emphasis is on power, not so much on identity. When we turn it into just, I'm an intersectional feminist, or I understand that's such a shallow surface way of looking at it. So for a while I tried so hard to sort of say, this is what she means when she said, you know, and you kind of start to feel like you're fighting a losing battle. And a lot of that is deliberate in terms of the way the term is obfuscated, right? It's deliberately muddied. It's deliberately turned into like almost a joke, you know, like how the term woke has become kind of a joke and a put down. That's not an accident. Every time that there is a theory that is put forward, or a way of, or a paradigm, a way of looking at and understanding our world, which is dominated by whiteness, it's quickly becomes the butt of jokes. It becomes not just demonized but ridiculed, and there's a reason for that, and that is to prevent us from actually understanding how these things work and how we can dismantle them.
Thank you. And not only, I guess our encouragement here in unpacking that, not only is it a very sophisticated, complex and brilliant theory that is academically valid, it was coined by an African-American professor of law. And as I boldly told my manager when I worked in state government, I refuse to be a white woman in the ivory tower misconstruing the theory of a black woman. That was a summary of the whole conversation. It wasn't a good ending for me, but it has to be said, and it has to be said. So in sort of this kind of whirlwind of me thinking about intersections of gender and race quite specifically, as the four of us have in different ways and in similar ways, about last year. I don't know if it came out last year or I watched it last year, the Q&A episode. Was that filmed 2 years? Okay, I watched it. I think I watched it 2020, 21. Who knows, because COVID destroyed my sense of time completely. But Ms. Ruby Hamad was on Q&A on the panel, and it was a panel of authors and writers, and one of the topics was Lionel, somebody, a white woman who's trashing black people in her books, and she was defending it on Q&A. And I watched this episode, and I was watching the intersections of gender and race at play, and I contacted the comms team, the wonderful comms team at the Institute, and I said, can we pull something together? And we had a bit of a chat about what to pull out, and we created a little 4-minute medley extract from that episode that we thought we would like to show you now. It sort of sets the scene, at least in the intersections of gender and race. So if our wonderful tech team up there could share that. And I do encourage you to watch the whole episode if you haven't. Okay, Ruby doesn't.
We are reminding people that the history of publishing is white people telling stories about everybody. That is what publishing was for so long. And it was white authors saying that they were the most authoritative and the most able to write about everybody's culture. And I think that this response now is saying, you know what? People are smart enough to write about themselves, that we trust people to write their own narratives and their own stories, and that we want to empower people to write not only understanding identity as an intellectual exercise, like I'm intellectually sort of inhabiting this other experience, but like I know it because I lived it, right? I think that that is like where this thrust comes from. And I do think that there's a difference between appropriation and appreciation. That appropriation is about exploitation. It is about centering your own experience as you inhabit another body or another life. Appreciation is saying, hey, I'm learning in this moment too. I'm like growing and I'm pushing myself as I explore something else, right? And what Toni says too in other writings is she's like black people are the best people to write about white people because we had to survive all of them, right? That is what Toni is like, we had to raise your kids, we farmed, we like built the country, we did all of it. So we are more able to write about all of you because we had to survive, right? Like that is sort of Toni's experience too. And I think that there is something to that again, that like they're writers who can inhabit other lives as an intellectual experience, but at a point, I don't want you to write about a gay black man as an intellectual experience. I want to hear somebody who lived it write this story. And this isn't to say that other people cannot, but it is about acknowledging that legacy, that it is only white authors who feel the authority to write about everybody else's culture as if they are the voice.
One of the sort of the big eye-openers for me in the research that I did in this book is, I think, a big, massive part of the reason why white women are still not believed when they talk about their experiences of sexual assault and of violence at the hands, particularly at the hands of white men, is that throughout history, white women, cellular history, where white women have been regarded as a protected class to be protected only from men of colour, only from the sexual deviancy of black men, and then when settlers came, brown men.
I was going to say, I am hoping that it is not your purpose to set, in the modern day, white women against minority women and in a contest of who's been more oppressed. Or that's one of my main problems with this way of thinking, the identity politics thing, is that kind of rivalry, which I don't think
didn't create the
in which
rivalry,
anybody
Lionel.
wins.
No, this is very important, and I know I'm sorry to take up other people's time, but I can't let that stand. If there's a rivalry, if there's a division in feminism, if there's a division in our society, it's not caused by people of colour, because we're talking about our oppression, because we're talking about our experiences of racism.
I'm not saying that
and it's not
that minority women are causing it, but it's a way of thinking, and I don't find it very productive.
But it's based on history, and it's based on our experiences.
Okay, I'm going to stop you just there for that point. DeRay, listening to this, what do you think? I mean, is there a sense in which white women in the United States have been let off the hook when it comes to the long history of racism?
So I think I hear this idea of nobody wins when we play the oppression Olympics, right? Like, that is just not a winning game.
Yeah.
I will say that there is something, particularly around whiteness, that we just aren't honest. That, like, the history of whiteness is a history of exploitation and domination. And I'm like, I didn't invent that. I'm not like the first person to say that. But when we think about white women specifically, you think about the new research that's come out about white female slave owners, right? That, like, there is this narrative that white women on plantations were just these passive bystanders while the men were inflicting all this damage. And the new research actually suggests that white women explicitly participated every facet of the institution of slavery, that they were, like, intimately involved in the persecution of people, they were intimately involved in the perpetuation and the defense of the institution. So there is something about naming the history, and it is this idea of not letting people off the hook in the way we tell the historical record. And when we talk about Trump, I mean, let's be clear, 53% of white women voted for him, and that is not something that we ignore, right? That happened. And there's something about being honest. When we talk about truth and reconciliation, we are reminded that the truth has to come before the reconciliation. And there are a lot of people that want to do all this reconciliation work without dealing with the truth first.
That's it. There is so much in that about the systems at play, the powers at play. I gather from the reactions that you noticed a lot of things there around how colour and gender played out as well in that panel. Part of the reason I say watch the whole thing, I know Ruby doesn't want you to, but because it was a traumatic experience actually, and I want to honour that. It was actually a very traumatic experience for Ruby to be on that panel. Ruby apologised for taking up space about 5 times in that panel and was cut off at least 5 times as well by Tony. That's the systems, they were talking about authorship and writing, we're talking about slavery and colonisation and so many various systems, and that kind of sets the scene. But we're going to hone in this panel about something very specific, gender-based violence, family violence and gender-based violence, and the way that gets racialised and the implications of that. So to bring us into that side of the conversation, Juliana, if you could sort of give us a definition or sort of a summary around gender-based violence as you see it in the work you do and I guess the life you've lived.
I think gender-based violence is much, much wider than violence against women. Actually, violence against women comes into the whole framework of gender-based violence. But gender-based violence is not only about women. It's about women, men, boys, and girls. It's a societal, instituted violence against all non-conforming groups. Let's hold that there, just as it is. and then we can break it down into where it sits with women and other groups of people. But it's basically universal. So there's no special cultural group or racial group that is specifically a group of people who embody gender-based violence. It's actually a universal process, and it's a universal process that is steeped in patriarchy. And it's the position of power over that determines what happens to people who are powerless in relation to the structure. That is where gender-based violence comes to. And we're going to break it down looking at race in relation to that. Yeah.
Great, thank you. These are all just sort of introductory statements, and I guess tying all of that in, Elizabeth, and I know you know something you're very passionate about, and you and I have had amazing hours of conversations about this. What do we mean, or how do you see the racialization of violence and the racialization of gender-based violence?
So I'll speak kind of from I guess within an Australian context, and more coming from a training and research perspective. What I find really interesting, firstly, is that the racialization of violence within an Australian context, I think, detracts from the truth, which is that colonization in this country and in many parts of the world was the ultimate form of violence. I think it takes away from that, because we start to dance around the issue and we racialize violence as being a product of some cultures, and inherently it's talking about non-white groups. And I hear this in training, people use different language. You know, people will say things like, family violence or, violence against women. In some cultures, there's almost this idea that violence is culturally sanctioned in some communities. And generally, when people are saying that, within kind of workshop context, they're saying that from the perspective of it's looking at racialized groups as collectives. But if we're talking about experiences of, for example, violence against women, where the case study or the central focus might be a white couple, then they are individuals. But when it's non-white people, that is a representation of their culture, and that says something about, it's inherent within their identity. But when it's whiteness, oh no, that's between these people, and we need to look at this as an individual issue. Nobody will ever say something like, like if somebody shared their story of violence, as a white person, that will never be seen as a representation of their entire race. But that is always the case when it is the non-white other. So I find that really interesting, within Australia. And I think one of the biggest central issues is also that there's still a denial of the reality of racism in this country. Like, that's an ongoing thing and I hear it in different ways, but we were talking about this last night, how when you talk about race, people will say things like, well, what about people with disability? And what about the rights of, LGBT? And what about sexism? But when you talk about disability, no one will ever say, but what about this other inequity? Why shouldn't we talk about that? Or what about the rights of so-and-so? So that's also something interesting that I've observed within an Australian context, that we're constantly trying to get away from race. And, you were saying the other day that, the term in Australia for race is really culture, because, in this country, we're still scared to even say the word race. But the reality is there's many racialized experiences in Australia, and there's a lot that happens that is because of systemic racism. But we're not able to, many people are not willing to name it. So the question is, how do you address something that you're not willing to even give a name to? Some thoughts.
This passion started when I pretty much started working in the family violence sector specifically, and delivering a lot of training and talking to a lot of practitioners in the space and meeting people who'd been there a lot longer than me and who were gender experts. And I was blown away by the way they could unpack misogyny and gender dynamics in the context of violence. And then if ever in a conversation, and every single time pretty much, if I was speaking to an Anglo-Australian practitioner and we started talking about violence in non-white communities, the same expert on gender would turn around and say to me, oh no, that's culture, that's part of their culture. And I literally just would have, it's very rare for me to be silenced, but I would be stunned into silence every time, like, you're an expert on gender 2 seconds ago, and now you're just brushing something off. It's been a huge frustration. I know you said it was interesting. It is interesting. It's also very frustrating for me. I've got a lot of words for what it is. So I guess in the work that I do, I think about how's this impeding? We've got a national action plan that just came out, and we want to end violence in a generation. I sort of boldly wrote on someone in High Profile's LinkedIn, I don't think we're going to end anything in a generation if we don't have some truthful conversations about this stuff. I hope we do, though. I hope we do end violence in a generation. I think it's really important, if we're on that pathway, that we are inclusive and intersectional in a proper way about these conversations. So I guess bringing you all in to the conversation, I just gave a little insight of my frustrations of how I feel impacted by the racialisation of violence in the work that I do. Is a tiny little thing, but I'm interested to hear from you in the various works you do. What are the implications that you're experiencing around the racialisation of gender-based violence? What issues does that create? How is that impacting your fields?
So I'm going to start that off because I have spent a good almost 30 years in Australia, leading Australia. I actively led Australia in the 90s and early 2000s around the issue of female genital mutilation, which I still am passionate about because of the way Australia handles it. And we really, in the beginning, in the 90s, racialized female circumcision, racialized it. It was the thing the African women do, the barbaric thing the African women do. And especially in Melbourne, on land on which we are today, it was really badly racialized. And as such that every African woman was deemed to be called a victim of a cultural practice, which is female genital mutilation. Female genital mutilation is a universal, global practice. The interesting thing about it is it took other communities and other cultural groups up to 2020 plus to put up their hands and say, we too do something. So in a sense, it suited some communities for it to have a black face. And I loved it because what others couldn't do, I stepped into the fray and I did it because I had a black face. Not because I liked the fact that it was racialized. I got really frustrated when more and more, as the years went by, we found that not only was it racialized, but it was a good platform for others to shift us around and say what they want to say and actually put us down for saying what the reality is. For example, if we say that this is a cultural practice and therefore we want to center the voices of the people who we have put up as the face of this issue, why can't we accept what the community says is okay with them, but to turn around and say, oh, well, why do you dare to call it the name you call it? The community says we don't want the name female genital mutilation because we're not mutilated. However, the worst part of it, we don't wear our voice on our shoulders either, right? But you want to define us as women with mutilated vulvas. We don't want it. We are women, full stop. And actually, we are women with a lot of agency. And therefore, you say to us, oh, but you cannot say that you are not mutilated because we think you are mutilated. Come on. For goodness sake, already you have put us in a certain box. Let us deal with that box. Whilst we are in that box, we're saying to you, shut up. Because we want to tell you what exactly it feels like to be in this box. And actually, you don't define the box for us. So the racialization is in that. We've carried it on to 2022 now. How about we tell ourselves it's time for us to look around and give back what the people really have as their identity, because that is theirs. And let them tell you what to do about it and with it. And don't jump on this bandwagon.
I'd like to invite both of you to jump in.
Oh, you find me up. I think when we talk about the racialization of violence, I guess to look at it more generally, I mentioned earlier how, you know, when we racialize violence, it takes away, continues to take away from the narrative of colonization, which, as we have, you know, talked about, was not necessarily an event, but is an ongoing process. But when we racialize violence, I think the impact, because you're talking about what does that mean in the context of our work, is that it stigmatizes individuals, families, and communities. And for a person who is subjected to gender-based violence, you know, it's in our best interest as a community that we create an environment that allows that person to feel safe enough to reach out to services that ideally should also be safe enough to access for them without barriers, etc., that the person has to go through in order to get support. So I think what it ultimately does is it further stigmatizes and isolates people, and it continues to build an atmosphere of distrust. Because when a person experiences violence, you know, we're talking in the context of violence within intimate relationships, within families. The ultimate form of trust for that person has been and continues to be destroyed by that experience of violence within the home. We then racialize violence as being a product of some other cultures, and that person who is at the center of that experience, who has to muster the courage to be able to disclose or seek support, that person is knocked back 100 times over and over again, because they will approach a service. And, you know, we talk about systems, but systems are also made up by people, right? And people have their own racialized ideas and biases, etc. So we also have to, I think a part of the conversation is looking at what is our individual responsibility, because the system continues to thrive because we're complicit. You know, we're a part of creating the system. So part of the conversation around systemic change is what is each of us in this room going to do to be a part of that systemic change? Because it's not this, you know, independent machine that just operates in isolation. We're all a part of it. So I think that's what I find really challenging, is that the person who is at the center of that experience of violence continues to be violated, not only within the home, but also by the services that they access, because they approach a service or an organization for support, and their experience is racialized or seen as being a product of, you know, savage, other cultural practices, etc., and that doesn't help that person at the end of the day. And I think that you know, when that trust is destroyed, it's really hard for the person to be able to come back again to seek support. You know, a response, you know, an initial response is really powerful in whether that person feels safe enough to, you know, speak to a counselor or be referred to another organization, or whether that will knock them back enough that they'll never be able to, or never be willing to speak about it again. So for me, it ultimately comes back to what is the impact on the individual, and that is that people are living, in very, I guess, vulnerable situations, but they continue to be knocked back more and more by the way that the system operates, but by the interventions that we put in place. And a lot of the interventions in Australia they're not culturally responsive, they're not culturally safe. So people continue to be pushed back.
Absolutely, and I think now you've fired me up. On that service delivery, the kind of on the ground in terms of the impact, absolutely we see, the service delivery not be appropriate. Having sat in so many men's behaviour change rooms, as a facilitator, and I was like, random, why would I sit in men's behaviour change rooms? Having sat in many of them, worked with hundreds of men, the other flip side of that I've seen as well is it's collusive, because the men that do come and do stay swallow that and say, oh, but Hala, that's our culture. And it's just a form of justification, and it's unjust, it's not right. And it's actually one of the most collusive statements that we're giving out as a society. We're giving some perpetrators of family violence something to hold on to and to say, well, that's just my culture, it's just my race. They don't really necessarily believe that, but unless we unpack that from a gendered lens, we allow it to continue. We then collude with that kind of justification for violence. And I guess that has an on-the-ground type of impact. But I'm interested too...
I just want to cut you off with that, because there's also the other side, Hala. The other side is a service provider who looks at the victim and says to the victim, but that's your culture, and I don't understand your culture. And because of that, I cannot give you the service that you require. But that's your culture. I don't understand your culture. Culture, race ought not stop us providing a service for an individual. And so what we do is, because it's your culture and I don't understand it, I'll send you to that agency over there that is under-resourced, that has no capacity. How many, if you look around, how many of our gender-based violence or violence against women or, services around there have in there culturally based workers who have the professionalism, except for bilingual workers?
Ruby.
All right, I want to take it into a wider, sort of a more abstract, just because I work mostly with theory. What I was thinking of as you were speaking, in sense of what does racialising gender-based violence do, and in terms of a lot of the work that I do, and where I do focus on the sort of the domineering class, right, the dominating class, and in the Western context, in Australian context, it is whiteness, and how it permits the women that are part of the dominating class to manoeuvre between the oppressed and the sort of oppressor, often unconsciously. So it actually, racialising gender-based violence furthers cultural and moral superiority of the dominating class. And I'm not picking on Sarah Hanson-Young, but she's just the first example that popped into my head, right? So a few years ago when, that young, brave woman from Saudi Arabia, whose name is just, because she changed her name, so completely escaped me, which shows the respect that I'm showing. But anyway, so when she locked herself in that Thai hotel room, and Sarah Hanson-Young was saying that we must give her asylum here so that she can live in a place that respects women, right? This is at the same time, or not long after, Sarah Hanson-Young had released her book about her experiences of racism and misogyny in the halls of Parliament. So what is it? So do you see how when gender-based violence is racialised, it actually allowed Sarah Hanson-Young to step into that cultural superiority, which is that legacy of colonialism, of saying you are a victim, not just of men or of gender violence, you're a victim of your culture. And although there's some sexism where I am, culturally, my country actually really respects women. So you can come here and you can live free and happy and free of violence, while at the same time, she wrote a book talking about how sexism and misogyny is entrenched in Parliament. So that is another aspect of what it does. It permits this sometimes unspoken, often spoken cultural superiority of whiteness that actually lets white people and white women miss a lot of what it is that they are being subjected to when they are being subjected to violence.
And I want to, on that note, because I think it's really worth mentioning, I almost want to like play it again like we often do when we do online webinars. In that Q&A episode, you said when women of colour are talking about feminism, I've forgotten your exact words, but you were alluding to the fact that our version of feminism is including all white women, and part of the reason white women haven't been believed when they talk about being victims of white men's violence against them is because only men of colour have been posed as the violators of white women. And you were inviting, not just Lionel, but white women into a conversation saying, we're trying to include you in a conversation around ending violence against women. And she responded to you by saying, I hope you're not creating segregation. What's your take? What's your reflection?
You saw my face. I still make the same face. It's like, I mean, I still like, how do you respond to that? There is, pointing out a division is not creating that division. And as Hala was saying, what I'm trying to say to white women is that you're missing a piece of the puzzle. You're missing a piece of the puzzle because that piece of the puzzle is that for centuries now, white men have been conditioned, once explicitly, now more implicitly, though not always, to only believe white women in certain circumstances. And when I say believe, they don't necessarily believe that the white woman is necessarily subject to violence. It's just politically expedient to do so. It suits their purpose, hence the lynchings in the US. So because it served a political and a social and capitalistic purpose, white women were quote unquote believed. But when it came to white women being targeted by white men, it's not politically expedient. That's a threat to white power. It's a threat to white male superiority. So it gets turned on the woman making the allegation. And so that is what I'm saying, that if white women want to find that missing piece of why are we still not believed despite everything that we say and we put forward, well, that's a part of it. You have to acknowledge the role that this legacy of colonialism and the targeting of black in particular and brown men, what that has done to you as women, as white women who are still, subordinated members of a dominant class. Is that clear?
Crystal. Okay, we've got about 20 minutes to go. Oh, they're waving at me and inviting people up. Great, fantastic. We do have and Maria, can I pick on you? I would love for you to come up here for 5 minutes as well and be a participatory audience member. Hello, welcome. There is a mic on that seat as well. Okay. If you feel like jumping up, please do. But what's your name?
Hi, I'm Nina. Hello, everyone.
Nina, you're our photographer, aren't you?
I'm here as an individual, just for 3 minutes. I'm so glad to be here and to have you talking about, such a interesting topic because we live in a violent society. So then I always have this question about how it's possible that we live in 21st century, we have everything to live in harmony, and to enjoy yourselves or different culture, practices, skills. But we are still in a world where we're talking about human rights. Why? So my question, because I have you here, I would love to know from your lived experience, what works for you in terms to fill the gap between race, violence, stereotype? What works for you, and what is the action that we can take today to go forward and to build the society that we want? And I would love to know as well, what is like the perfect society that you would love to have? Let's think we are, maybe all of us, we are the fairies of change. If you have a magic wand, how it could look, this society? Because we need to reimagine. And I think that's the kind of black hole that we fall into, because we don't know how we would like to build that city.
To build a new kind of world.
The new kind of world is called a world where human rights prevails and rules. It's the word human rights. But before you came up, I wrote on my paper, call to action around authentic allyship. And that's a word I picked up from Maria this morning. It's not black and white. It's not about black and white. Because you know, like that young man said, black will share and black shares all the time. Unfortunately, white takes. That's colonization. Okay, it's not black and white. It's about our humanity. And it's about all of us learning to walk with one another. That sounds like strange words, but that's the truth of the matter. If you can walk in my shoes and you can stop a minute to understand what is going down for me, where are my pain points in the midst of all the systemic issues, we'll get it right. Who next?
That's a really big question. I think for me, if we lived in a world where the inherent dignity of all human beings was recognized and upheld, we wouldn't be having these conversations. It wouldn't be a thing to have to aspire to. We would just exist, I think, in the fullness of our humanity. But we still live in a world where the inherent dignity of some humans is not recognized. And I think that that's a part of the biggest issue. And it's the reason why, we talk about issues of the racialization of violence. It doesn't really matter what the topic is. I think it goes back to that core being the dignity of our humanity. It's been lost. We're still living in a world where, even though no one will openly acknowledge this, we're still living in a world where we see whiteness as the hallmark of superiority and of civilization and of advancement, and everybody else is like the savaged other. And no, we don't say these words, but it shows up in how people are treated. It shows up in just everyday interactions that many people have. And for those of us that have lived experiences of racism, for example, that's a daily experience. It doesn't matter what context you're in. You can be in a professional setting. I get all kinds of interesting questions that an average white woman my age would never get. And that's because we live in this world that is still very racialized, where the inherent dignity of black and brown people, more specifically, has not been recognized and will not be recognized. And I think that that's a part of the biggest issue. So the ideal world is we wouldn't be here. And I love what you said, Irfan, earlier, because I actually thought about that myself. I thought, if I didn't live in this world, what would I actually do? I have other interests and passions and many other talents. And if I wasn't, if I didn't exist in this body and in this life, what would things look like? How would I show up in the world?
You'd be jumping on a trampoline.
I would be jumping on a trampoline, absolutely.
Excuse me, can I say something? I want to add to that. It just reminded me, Elizabeth, of what you were saying, of how, about the inherent human dignity and also that's not recognised, and also how society is made up. of individuals that feed into the system. So a couple of weeks ago, I was giving a talk in Tasmania at a volunteering Tasmania conference, and so I'm talking a lot about these ideas and a lot about how the dignity of women of colour, black and brown women, is not recognised in various ways that are there's commonality, but is also specific to their particular race and ethnicity. And afterwards, and I have to commend her for actually admitting this to me, so an older white woman came up and spoke to me, and she said, you know, you've really forced me to think about myself. She said, a lot long ago, I was waiting in line, or I was walking up to wait in line or something, and I saw an Asian couple. And I looked at them and I just sort of thought, well, I can go in front of them. She goes, and she goes, I wasn't like thinking, oh, they're Asian, I can go in front of them. She goes, I just had this feeling that I should be able to. And if I had to tell myself why that was, I would probably say, oh, it's because I'm older, right? They should respect me because I'm older. She goes, but listening to you today, I have to admit, I think it's because I'm white, and I thought that. And she had this look of complete shock and surprise on her face. Like, I could tell she was being genuine. She was just kind of like, it's because I thought I'm white. So this is what it takes as well, right? And that, because we do have to, you know, there's a Carl Jung quote, right? Carl Jung, the psychoanalyst, where he said, you know, the psychology of the individual is the psychology of humanity. So as goes humanity, so goes the individual. We need that change on both levels. We can't forget about our individuality in the sense of what we can do as individuals and the impact that we can have, both negative and positive, at the same time as not losing sight of the way in which society is structured in a certain way to make it difficult for us to exert and enact our humanity in a way that benefits us all. But the first step, she took a first step. First she admitted it to herself, and then she admitted it to me. Like, that is pretty huge.
Thank you. I'm going to quickly answer that as well, because it's actually something I'm very passionate about. I'm so passionate about it that I launched the Institute of Nonviolence. And we called it that on purpose. I called it that on purpose because I wanted the word nonviolence to be in the title. When I looked around at family violence services and other violence services, they've all got the word violence in there. Our sort of vision is to create a world where non-violence is the social norm, because what I learned in doing family violence work is that violence is our social norm, and it's embedded in, as we've been talking about, the systems and the structures that are in place. So it's literally about restructuring, and for me, restructuring doesn't look like the same hierarchies and institutions we've got, but with women on top, or anybody on top. We have to dismantle them for real. So if you're the CEO of a giant hierarchy and you're talking about dismantling the patriarchy, you're not. I'm really sorry. But you actually have to step down and create cyclical models. And I take my inspiration from various indigenous populations around the world, my own ancestry from the Middle East, and Mother Nature. And I'm just looking at how collaborative Mother Nature is and how species thrive when they collaborate and work together. Now we have another, your name please, and your statement or question.
My name is Faize. They call me Pfizer for short, so you can remember it. But why I came on this panel, because believe it or not, my son is named Kofi from Ghana because we lived in Ghana, so I really appreciate that. But more importantly, because I'm a global citizen. And I think that in order, sometimes the stuff that I'm going to say might sound a little bit slightly different from this information that we all received. It is that as a global citizen, we can perhaps eradicate some of our thinking, because what I always say is let your vision be global, let your vision be world-embracing, rather than confined to your own self. When you think globally, you will sometimes forget who you are. I came from a home with domestic violence for 23 years. So I've done the trek of walking, seeing the services, even asking support for my religious groups, again, being rejected. So I've done the hard yakka. But still, at the end of it, I will not call myself just a woman, a brown woman, but I will call myself a global citizen who just has had something done, but has risen and has resilience. And so therefore I started an organization for children called Children See, Children Do. And it is really about how we can instill in our children this idea that we're global citizens. We have to eradicate violence from all segments of society, particularly domestic violence. And even in our organization, we do not discuss just women being subjected to violence, but men. Many men, trust me, when we've spoken to them, feel that they can never express themselves either and say that they're subjected to violence, because if they go to the police, they will be called wusses. So I have friends in the police who also have confirmed that this is what happens to them too. So that men also suffer violence, women suffer violence, but if we think globally and we work not on issues of perhaps our gender or where we come from, it will make for a very, very happy event. I do recall
Thank
that
you, sorry. If it's okay, just because we're running out of time and there's a couple
I just want to say that my son, who went through the violence at a very young age, and I managed to escape for the third one only, at the age of 8, I told him off, I'd escaped because I thought I'd be shot actually in the head. And I was crawling under the window so that I wouldn't be shot, and I saw my son mimicking me. He was crawling under the window too. And afterwards, when I said to him, go to bed, hurry up, go to bed, son, he said, Mom, don't shout. But I was just like exploding. And I said, son, I'm not shouting. And I
sorry,
laughed.
Faiza, I'm sorry. We don't have, to
he said,
stop you there. But
don't minimize it. Don't minimize violence. So that's what I want to say.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing the story. It reminded me of some of the conversation earlier this morning when there was conversations about unity and the unity of humanity. Thank you for joining us on the panel. And if you don't, we'll make way for someone else waiting. And Sarah, you're sitting here.
Thank you. Well, thanks, Hala.
They take a bit of time to warm up. You turn them on and they need 2 seconds.
It's on. Yeah. Thank you, Hala, for the beautiful introduction. My name is Sarah, and I came on this panel to really ask that question. We've all heard the idea of like changing the story, but I wanted to pose the question, what does that actually look like to you? How do we take away that racial element, and also how do we build those authentic partnerships and that community-guided discussion around about preventing family violence with services that are supposed to be first responders?
Juliana or Elizabeth?
That's a tough.
Sorry, I turned it off.
You did. Why did you come and ask us such a tough question?
Can I jump in while your mic's warming up? Please, if you're out there, don't ever tell anybody that they've used violence or experienced violence because of their culture and race. Let's start with that. And when you're listening to stories, the news, I know I'm guilty of this. The propaganda is real. We're all indoctrinated in colonial mentalities. I certainly catch myself sometimes thinking about someone's culture or ethnicity or race or religion, and I catch myself within seconds, and then I start to analyze. I draw on the intellectual information I've gathered over time. It starts with us too, I think, not just what we do with other people, but actually go, what's really happening? What systems are at play? What are the complexities around here? What's going on? What are the dynamics of power play? Because the use of violence at the end of the day is around power and power over. And so it's about looking at it from that angle. And the other thing that I've learned to do is expand my readership and what I watch and what I listen to, the poetry, the songs, okay, music-wise, I was always very diverse, but I read new authors now. I read authors that I haven't read before. I watch people on YouTube that I might have flicked past before. So I just challenge myself to expand where I'm getting my information from as well.
That's a good answer. Okay.
Coming from Juliana, thank you.
The question that I want to bring back to you, because you asked the question about changing the story, is what is the story? Because unless we understand what the story is, we can't start to change it. Even though in this room, we all know that the drivers of violence, gender-based violence, is patriarchy. The main driver is patriarchy. And in that cycle, on that wheel, in the middle of that wheel is power and control. That happens in every culture, every racial group, everywhere. So if we're going to change the story, then we're going to have to look from the position of whose story are we looking at and how are we going to work. And also, finally, to say that if we're going to change the story, we don't change the story, we change the story with. So you don't come and impose a new story, but we need to work with the group that we want to change the story for.
Thank you. We can, thanks for the question, Sarah. Well, Khalees? Just turn it on, wait 2 seconds and it'll work.
Okay. Thank you.
And we might invite the last person to come up. Thank you, Sarah.
Hi. Well, first, thank you guys so much for speaking today. I've really learned a lot. My question, I guess, related to the ending violence in a generation and just thinking about what ideological shifts that would require in order to make that happen. But Elizabeth's point on how like a lot of the problems come from the not acknowledging the inherent humanness of people, I think, and dignity of people, I think that is really, could just be like another way to define racism, and how that underlies a lot of the problems that we have in society, like thinking about, even ecologically, how unless you allow people to live in places like living next to landfills or living in places with air pollution or like all of the ecological things as well, like I guess not acknowledging the humanness of people like also contributes to that. And so, yeah, but that's the question that I wanted to ask.
Would you like to? Within that, sorry, what is the question within that?
So, okay, yes. So I guess, well, the first question, just thinking about it systemically, I guess is like what systemic, so I guess first I was just making that point, and then next I wanted to ask, I guess, what are the systemic things that you think cause people to use violence as the outlet or like lead to violence being the thing that I guess people resort to?
That's a really big question too. I guess as you were asking that, I was thinking about, a quote came to my mind by Madiba, Nelson Mandela, where he said that, and you know, I'm kind of paraphrasing, he said something to the effect of that we are taught to hate, and that our natural nature as human beings is actually to love, but we are taught to hate. And because we're taught to hate, we can also be taught to love. So I think when I think about violence, it is taught, but it's also, it's taught not only within kind of a family context, but also we live within a structural context where, you know, we see in the media, for example, we see it in different, I guess, domains, and we see it in entertainment. We see it in every aspect of our lives. So I think we learn violence. I think we learn, you know, those behaviors, and we take on the attitudes and the beliefs that lay a foundation for violent and abusive behavior. I think in terms of, I think there was a part two to that question in terms of the systemic. You asked about what is required to, end violence against women more specifically. I think it linked to your point earlier within a generation. Again, that's a big undertaking, but a huge part of that, I think, is consciousness raising, because we're socialized into an environment where we take on certain ideologies and beliefs, and that translates into certain behaviors. So I think a big part of creating that broader change is raising consciousness, so that people are able to address the issues of violence both within themselves, but also within their kind of spheres of influence as well. Because I think in the same way that we internalize racism, we also internalize other things like violence. We excuse it in different ways. We might hear a racist joke or a sexist joke, and we go, oh no, it's too uncomfortable for me to say anything. So I'm going to lead towards my comfort and just not say anything, because maybe it doesn't affect me personally, or what have you. So I think it's about being willing to have a conversation and engaging in genuine allyship with Juliana also brought up earlier. And I think letting go of this performative allyship, which I know, Maria, you brought up this morning as well, because that's something that we've also seen, particularly kind of post Black Lives Matter. There was a lot of activists that came out of nowhere. And then now I'm thinking, where are they? Like, I went to the rally and I felt so supported, but now it's like, it's silent, like it's cricket now. You say racism and people are like, oh, well, let's talk about unconscious bias. Like, this is too deep. Why are we talking about racism, and why are we talking about colonization, and why are we bringing up history, and why are we upsetting and traumatizing people? And it's like, no, look, you're 45. If my 6-year-old child can experience racism at school and I have to have a conversation with them at home, then you as a 45-year-old man can handle, a 3-hour conversation about this. And I'm just over people making excuses.
Yes. Okay, we'll have one final. Thank you so much, Khalees. We'll have one final question or comment.
Okay. Well, as the only person that stands between us and lunch.
That is so insightful.
I'll make this quick. First of all, quite in awe of the whole space, the platform, the wonderful panelists with whom some of whom I could make personal contact earlier. Just a couple of comments, though, in terms of the questions that were asked about the next steps. Basically, myself having, of course, lived experience coming from the Middle East, like Hala, I think we're all maybe terrorists. So, I mean, there are, racialized everything. But what I wanted to just say is, I think one way to overcome is to think of a higher purpose and to start discussing racialized gender violence, bias, prejudices, in a broader discussion of our oneness. We have to commit to a higher power to overcome deficiencies, for want of a better word. And I think once we see with that balcony view that the world is, nature, as you've all said, integrates human body, human beings. I mean, we wouldn't be a whole human if, our one leg was in competition with the other. So, what I'm trying to say is, if we all can have this broader discussion in platforms of our underlying oneness, then that defines why we need to overcome the prejudice. And it gives us that intent, just short of.
Absolutely, thank you. Yes, so why don't you do that? So my next thing was to finish up is not to ask the panelists, thank you so much, not to ask the panelists for a final statement, but your statement of invitation to continue this conversation for the audience. And we'll start with you, Juliana.
My invitation is from the 25th of November to the 10th of December is the global 16 days of activism on gender-based violence. I would like you to note those dates and think about what you can do about gender-based violence. Don't know about you? Take action, take some action, take some responsibility, and create awareness of your people and your area of influence. That's my next forward.
Ruby? Okay, so I don't really have one, but what I will say is, just in regards to what everyone was saying about the dignity of humans and how what our natural inclination is whether to love or to hate, as it now seems. I just want to be wary of that and say you don't have to have strong feelings one way or another towards other people to recognise their right to live free and free of violence. So you can feel completely neutral. By neutral, I mean not having strong feelings, and not as in not neutral, as in not taking a side. You must always take the side of justice. But you don't have to have a personal connection to them in any way. You don't have to have any personal feelings for them to recognise that right. Ideally, we want to all be able to love each other, but we're never going to meet most of the other people on this incredibly huge planet. But we can still respect and fight for their right to live free and free of violence.
I would invite you, I think I was kind of thinking along the same lines as yourself, to think about the notion that my humanity is bound up in yours. So when we talk about equity and justice, it's not for some of us, it's for all of us. And to know where you are privileged and where you may be disadvantaged, and to be willing to use your privilege to be able to stand up for humanity. That's what we're talking about. You're not standing up for this group or that group, you're standing up for humanity. So recognizing that you have to do something, is all I'm gonna say. Like you have to do something. It's necessary.
Couple of things to wrap that few, actually, more than a couple. One, as you go about and engage in the 16 days of activism and beyond, and keep going with the standing for justice. Don't take a break from it, even if you've got the privilege to. As you do that, seek support, seek a network like this one, connect with people. Like I pretty much stalked these 3 women and said, I need more I need to connect with people like you, have chats, and it's therapeutic really to just jump on Zoom and have a vent every now and then. But find your crew that will keep you going, energize you, so that you are also taking care of yourself in the process, so that we can eventually rest when we've restored justice. The other thing, that's my sort of invitation, my piece of advocacy for myself, if not for anyone else, is if anyone in control of the temperature in this room can hear me, I'm freezing. When you've got the mic, say something that matters to you. And my final comment is to thank you. It's been a dream of mine to bring the 3 of you together, and so glad Newkind exists so that I had the opportunity to do that. It's been an absolute pleasure to share the stage, and thank you to the audience who participated and